All right, thanks everyone. So I'm going to be talking to you about breaking a Bitcoin wallet with EMF5. My name is Colin O'Flynn. I have sort of two roles I deal with. So I have a startup, New AA Technology Inc., and I'm also a assistant professor at the local university, Dalhousie University. So I admit this version of the slides isn't the one I was trying to give. The version I was trying to give, I discovered, has some logistical issues. Because what I've always wanted to use is to prove that, it doesn't matter how fancy your visuals are, just some basic slides is all you really need. So this is the version that I hoped you could see. There you go. So you can also do this presentation. The issue is as soon as you want photos, what happens is this. If you try to put anything besides some of the nice clip art, no resources, insufficient resources. So because it's nice to show you things, I decided to give you photos in a recent version of PowerPoint. All right, so the two roles I have, with Dalhousie University, they basically have a new thing called the Idea Hub, and this is designed to help startups. As part of that, I'm in the electrical and computer engineering department. I'm working on cybersecurity research, so some of the stuff I'm talking about, and also helping local embedded startups deal with cybersecurity threats, really specific to embedded systems. My startup, New AA Technology Inc., has an open source project called Chip Whisperer, which I'm extremely skeptical of this claim, but HackerOne showed it as the fourth most used tool in pen tests, so I barely believe that, but anyway, it's something someone else claimed, so I can put that there. So we sell physical hardware as well as training and stuff like that related to hardware security. As sort of a side note, this talk includes Bitcoin, blockchain. Whenever you include like Bitcoin or blockchain, you always get people asking you questions and all of a sudden they want to have you advise on their blockchain. So I have to make it clear that I don't care about blockchain. In 2010, I downloaded the wallet when the website looked like this and you got a few Bitcoin just for signing up. And I said to myself, this is dumb, and I deleted it. And I never looked back. I regret nothing. They've intersected again, so blockchain and Bitcoin have intersected with embedded systems. I care about embedded systems, and this is why Bitcoin is in the talk itself. There's no way to go through it, though, without a really brief background to what is blockchain. So it's useful to have kind of an idea of what we're talking about. So blockchain, really briefly, you have two things. So you have a block. This is like your standard concrete masonry unit block. And you have a chain. This is like a straight link coil chain. So if you wanted to do something like secure a voting booth, right, it's very easy to steal this voting booth. So you could use blockchain to secure the voting booth to the ground with a very heavy concrete block. Now the problem is, if you want to move this around, it's a bit large. There's another interesting history. The actual first implementation of it is by H. Simpson in May 2008. So this predates the more well-known computer-based implementation. And these timelines are legitimate. You can check that out. So this is the real beginning of blockchain. All right, so how do we do embedded blockchain? This is where we start looking at embedded hardware wallets. So, it's hard to transport these blockchains around, stuff like that. So then we have the embedded blockchain. So these are very small, portable blockchains that can be used for securing your embedded systems. And embedded blockchain has given rise to all sorts of really cool secure wallets. The most well-known, you might have heard of John McAfee, had his BitFi wallet. And there was sort of this series of tweets where John McAfee said, BitFi is unbreakable. There's no way anyone can hack it. Then someone hacked it, and then they said, by the way, I guess maybe it's not unbreakable. There's some pretty cool other wallets out there. So ASIC Vault, this is legitimate, so you can go look at this stuff. ASIC Vault labels itself the first physically secure cryptocurrency vault. Sounds good? How does it work? Well, what they've done is they've taken the key derivation function, which would be used to convert your PIN code into the encryption key. And normally things like these little other software wallets I'm talking about would run that key derivation function like 2,000 times. So what they've done is they actually made an ASIC that hardware accelerates the key derivation function. So this is kind of interesting because if you wanted to break their wallet, what you'd really want to break their wallet is an ASIC that accelerates the key derivation function. And what they give you is an ASIC that accelerates the key derivation function. So you can use a second version of their wallet to probably attack the first version. They also have some pretty cool stuff like, depending how much you pay for the base wallet, and also how much you pay per month, changes how many times they run that key derivation function. So if you're a sucker and only pay 10 euros per month, you only get 1 million key derivation rounds. But if you pay more, they give you 3 million key derivation rounds. So a lot of this stuff is like, you know, you wonder where investors got involved in this, because it's always these crazy business models. Which also sort of brings up, you know, like, how big is this market for real? There's more Bitcoin wallets around. So another company, Ledger, has claimed to sold 1 million wallets, and they're at least $100 each. So, and that's just one of the companies. This is actually a pretty big market for these little Bitcoin wallets, which to me was pretty surprising, because I, as I said, wasn't really involved in this stuff. All right, so now talking about more real things. What I'm actually going to be looking at is the Trezor Bitcoin wallet. So this is another Bitcoin wallet that has an ability to store Bitcoins on some physical device. So the idea is someone can't hack your computer to recover your Bitcoins. They have to hack this physical wallet. And they list all sorts of really nice security features. So, you know, they say, okay, there's all these different passwords, firmware verification, even stuff like an ultrasound hardware seal. And some of these features sound really good, but it's kind of interesting to see what they look like in real life when you start looking at these things. So let's take a look at that. All right. So I'm sorry, Clifford, too. I did have a document camera sitting here this morning, but I felt like the video camera version was a lot more fun. So if you look at one of their Bitcoin wallets, this is there we go, a Trezor Bitcoin wallet. And so they have this ultrasonic seal is basically how the plastic is joined. So you can see it's two pieces that's molded. And one of the initial claims is that, you know, it would be very hard to break that case and reseal it because of that. Let's see if I can focus. So if you want, you can see it later. It's a bit hard with the lighting. Okay, there we go. So you can see that seal there. Now this particular one actually previously has been broken. And you can see that, in fact, it can break and join back up pretty easily. So, you know, some of this stuff is maybe a little oversold with how easily it would be to break these in real life. But of course, that's not what we're solely interested in. We want to see how well could we actually recover Bitcoins from this thing. That's phase one. So, and that's kind of like the initial, you know, analysis is what's inside this thing. This device is actually really nice because it's open source. So you can take the device, you can modify the source code, you can reprogram it, do whatever you want. And it also means lessons learned on the Trezor can be applied outside of just Bitcoin wallets. So some of the source code or much of the source code they're using is reused in other areas. And so it's actually a pretty nice target because it's a really good device to learn lessons on and to talk about embedded security in general. What I'm talking about in particular was fixed with a firmware patch like a month or two ago. So the exact issue I'm disclosing has also been fixed on this hardware itself. So what I'm looking at is something called the recovery seed. So from the Trezor documentation up here, what it tells you is that the recovery seed is this critical element for security of the wallet. Basically this seed lets someone else clone the wallet. So if you figure out what this recovery seed is, someone else can see what's in your wallet and steal funds from it. This is pretty cool because it means if someone gets access to it, you don't even know they have access to it. So they could steal this recovery seed while you're still actively using your wallet and wait for you to have money in it. So it's a pretty sensitive piece of information. And they basically have this seed with the idea being that when you set up the wallet, you write it down, and then if your wallet is destroyed, you have a way to recover the funds. You can also password protect that. So this isn't done by default, but there's an option to include a password in this seed. And if there's a password, it basically makes the attack I'm talking about not work, because all of a sudden you have some information that's not stored on the device that's required to recover it. So inside, I just showed you what these guys look like, but there's a bit of a better photo. There's basically one microcontroller. And one of the issues is that this main microcontroller is not what we call a secure device. It's kind of a standard off-the-shelf microcontroller. You can buy it, I can buy it, anyone can get information on it. If you're storing, millions of dollars on this microcontroller, there's a lot of different ways to get information out of that device. So if it costs $50,000 to get the information out, that's pretty reasonable to do so if you know there's millions of dollars stored on that exact microcontroller. That's one of the fundamental problems. And this was kind of a lesson that was learned. So there's a really good book on the PayTV hacking industry, basically. That's really interesting, so I always highly recommend it. But these lessons were learned in satellite TV hacking times. Your credit card has a secure microcontroller in it. So the types of attacks that can be used pretty easily on the Trezor would not work on something like a credit card, because there's an incentive to hack the device, and it becomes very easy to quantify how secure should we make this device. With the Bitcoin wallet, is the incentive there? It's kind of less clear on what the incentive with the Bitcoin wallet is. And that's really the problem with this type of thing, is that, at the end of the day, these are consumer devices that are being trying to sell for as small a cost as possible, while also, having some claim level of security. But there's no, standard for what this security is within the Bitcoin domain. So that's where it sort of becomes a problem of, you just have to trust what's written here is valid and makes sense. All right. So there was a talk, this was sort of inspired by a talk in December at 35C3, also looking at these same devices. So three guys, Dimitri, Josh, and Thomas, they actually attacked the Trezor Bitcoin wallet as well, and they were able to recover this information from SRAM in the device. So it was a different attack that was patched a different way, but basically, in talking to Dimitri, he had told me about, hey, this works, you can just get the data out of the device. So it was pretty clear that this recovery information was actually stored inside the device itself. That talk actually looked at a few other vulnerabilities as well, but for Trezor specifically, what you basically had is this special recovery seed you could copy to SRAM. Once it's in SRAM, there's a way to read out this backup. It required physical access to the PCB, so you'd open the enclosure, attach some probes, do some voltage fault injection to allow you to read the SRAM and dump it out. But it was pretty reliable, so the sort of nice thing is that if you had the device, it was pretty easy to dump it very quickly. Whereas what I wanted to look at is how else could you get it, hopefully in a way that doesn't involve actually opening the device up. So you think, like with a screwdriver to your head apparently in this stock photo, and you think of other ways that you could get information out of this device, and in particular the recovery seed. And the recovery seed and also the device pin are stored in flash memory. And we know what the flash memory layout looks like. In this case, it's open source, so it's super easy to get the layout. And we know it's at this location here. And what I was looking at is what happens in the bootloader a little bit before that. So what's going on in the bootloader code, and is there anything in the bootloader code that we could actually access? And basically, one of the things in the bootloader code is these USB device descriptors. So when you plug a USB device into your computer, it says, hey, what am I? I'm a webcam, something like that. And it does this in a device descriptor, which is basically a big binary chunk of data that's sent over USB. And these are all part of the USB standard. Each of the descriptors has a certain length. It includes many optional components. So the computer has to ask the device, please send me, as much data as I need to understand what you are and how I talk to you. This is done in this request. So there's this get descriptor request. And it returns basically some information on what the actual device is set up as. Now, one of the requests, or part of the request, is this W length field. Which basically says how many bytes do I want to return from the descriptor. And the reason we need this is on the computer side, it may only want to read the first 60 bytes or 100 bytes because it doesn't care about a very large descriptor. So it's going to say, please give me up to 100 bytes of the descriptor. The end device will basically say, I will give you either as much data as you requested, or if my descriptor is smaller than that, I'm only going to give you the size of the actual struct in memory. So it's sort of this or condition, right, where it says, okay, what do? We give you whatever the required size you need. So how is this done? In software, this is done with this simple min call. So basically what you have is you see that this len here is the W length from the USB request. So we have the length requested from the computer or the size of the descriptor stored in flash memory. This length is a 16-bit value, so theoretically you can request up to 65K, but the end device is going to limit you to however much memory is actually in the flash itself, or the size of the descriptor in the flash itself. So if we could corrupt this, what this would mean all of a sudden is that it's going to think the descriptor is much larger than it is, because I can request 65K of memory. If we could corrupt that value such that it thinks the descriptor is much larger, it's all of a sudden going to return a huge chunk of memory directly over USB. And you'll notice, for example, this whole section here, this bootloader code is only 32K. So we could, in fact, guarantee from the bootloader, if we could return 65K, we could guarantee that we could read the entire metadata, which includes all of the important information we're trying to recover. So that's really what the attack is trying to do. How this happens is that at the assembly language level, when we look at that compiled code, again, it's open source, so we can really easily do this. What you have is it's now comparing, right, the input data to the known struct length, which is hex 92 here. This known struct length of hex 92, it then says, well, compare which one's bigger. We'll put the smaller one into the variable that we then stack. So what you could do is that if you could skip this single move instruction, right, when it's copying the value over, when it's copying the smaller value over, we would all of a sudden be able to return as much data as we wanted. And that's basically the idea. The nice thing about the Trezor, it's open source, as I mentioned, so you can be super lazy. You can do something like this, which is to use an external debugger, get a device, reprogram it. You have to change the chip out because the default ones have the JTAG locked down, change the chip. And we can simulate this glitch. So what I can do is I request 65K of data. I get the expected response most of the time, 146 bytes coming back. But sometimes it sends back 65K, or not sometimes, the time that I corrupted that comparison. So I use the debugger to sort of skip that comparison. So now I know that if I skip the comparison, it's going to work exactly as I expect. It's going to let me return all that data. And we can also confirm that inside that data, basically the way Bitcoin is recording the recovery seed is it actually records these like English language phrases. So we can actually see those strings in the data that was sent back. There would be a pin here, but I didn't actually set a pin on this device, so it doesn't show up in memory. But this is the metadata section. There's special store tag and stuff like that. So basically, this was read over the USB from doing a simulated glitch, which was phase 1. Okay, so how are we going to get a real glitch? How are we actually going to cause this to happen in real life, not in my chintzy simulator here? What we're going to do is we're going to use something called EMF5. So EMF5, electromagnetic fault injection, basically says we're going to take a coil, we're going to drive a current through it. Driving a current through it generates a strong magnetic field. That magnetic field is going to induce a voltage in a nearby device, such as the Trezor. And the induced field is going to corrupt memory or corrupt something else. So in this case, it could corrupt the program counter to skip over instructions. There's all sorts of nice effects that can give us the desired result. The coils themselves, I mean, they look like kind of standard coils. These are actually just standard off-the-shelf type inductors, but you have a coil of wire around this ferrite, so this is a magnetic material that helps to concentrate the flux over a smaller area. People sometimes ask me, why do you need a high voltage? You put a high voltage across the current to get a very strong field because sort of nature hates you, basically. We just want a high rate of change of current through the coil, which doesn't necessarily mean a high voltage. But we also want a lot of churns of wire around a coil to get a stronger magnetic field. The inductance increases with the number of churns. The higher inductance means we need a higher voltage to get this fast current change. So there's some trade-off of wanting a lot of churns of wire, but also wanting a very fast rate of change of current. And we want this fast rate of change because if you look back to this code, right, I only want to have this fault affect a very small section of the microcontroller running. I only want it to affect for, 10 or 20 nanoseconds of the time that it's actually executing these instructions. Otherwise, it should be operating as normal. So this is what it looks like. Basically, this is the setup to do EMFI on the Trezor. The device on the top is a chip shorter, so this is something I designed that charges a capacitor bank up to high voltage, and with very precise triggering is able to dump it into this coil here. And this coil, you can see, is just placed over top of the outside of the case. So I haven't actually had to open the case of this device. There's two screws that just push against the buttons to force it into bootloader mode. So when the buttons are pressed down and the USB cable's turned on, it enters bootloader mode. To trigger it, it's triggered from a special USB analyzer, a total phase Beagle 480. This is basically a device that can see physical data going across the USB bus. I can set up a trigger based on some specific packets. The trigger that's set up based on some specific packets is when I'm doing that read request. So when I'm requesting the descriptor, I say I keep requesting it with my 65K of data I want sent back, and I use that to know roughly when to insert the glitch. And then I'm just going to kind of sweep around because it's not going to be exactly that time that it's doing it, and I'm just going to keep trying. So it's not perfectly reliable, but if it works once, it gives me the required data to break the device. There's a second project, too, that's not ready for this talk, but PhiWhisper USB. So this is like an open source hardware software tool I'm working on that'll basically help you do this type of triggering. So you can watch out for that in the coming months. So this is what the full setup looked like. So you had the Trezor here. I already showed you that. This is using ChipWhisper solely to do a trigger search. So it's solely using this to delay the trigger to insert it at the right moment in time. The Beagle 480 I mentioned, we need to use that to generate the trigger signal. And finally, there's a USB switch here. So this is just used to power cycle the Trezor. When the Trezor detects fault conditions, it sort of goes into a hard loop, and you have to power cycle it to get it back to working. All right, so I don't have that full setup here. So what I'm going to show you instead is just sort of what happens with EMFI. So here's one of the Bitcoin wallets. Maybe that's easiest. And if we plug it in, right, you'll see it boot up. And there's a bit of a sync issue, so don't worry about that. My Trezor. So if I hold these buttons down, it's instead going to go into bootloader mode. And you can see it gives you, there's a hash of whatever the current, I think it's the current bootloader or something like that is. So the idea is you can verify what's running on it the whole time. Let's refocus. All right, so to insert a glitch, I showed you before, there's this device that generates a high voltage put across that coil there. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold down this button when it's to generate the pulse. So what you'll see with this guy is that as you have to get quite close for this to work, but eventually it's actually going to corrupt some stuff, and it should enter, oops. So if you can read that, it says hard fault detected. Please unplug the device. So this is just triggering some memory corruption routine. So you have to get the timing exactly right to not corrupt memory during regular usage. Yeah, memory fault detected. So if you can see that. Of course, you have to get the timing just right to corrupt just that comparison without causing any of these error conditions to happen. So that's kind of the trick, right? And that's why I need this power cycle, is that I don't really know the exact timing. I'm just going to set it up to do a whole bunch of glitching. Hard fault detected, and so forth. So you basically set this up and leave it running for quite some time, and eventually it would give me the correct USB traffic going back. There's a third error. I'm seeing if I can get the third error. So there's also like a stack smashing detected, which is basically memory fault, when it detects that some of the stack has been corrupted, so it's also trying to prevent various types of attack. So all these countermeasures were already present when I looked at it. So these don't stop the attack from working, just the fact that they had turned on a lot of the various countermeasures available in the device. So how did they fix it? There's basically a few ways they were able to fix it. The first thing they did is there's a memory protection unit in the STM32. So we armor the sensitive data with invalid memory segments. So where we have that sensitive metadata, if you look way back, the issue is I can read from the bootloader right into that metadata. So what they were able to do is insert invalid memory segments in between that, with the idea being that if you read from the bootloader and just scanned forward, as I'm forced to do basically, it wouldn't hit the metadata. So if you could corrupt where the pointer was, you could get lucky and maybe hit the metadata, but it's a much, much less likely attack to work. That's actually the main thing they did. You could theoretically move the memory layout around, right? So we could put the metadata at the beginning, so there's no pointers that point ahead of it. This isn't quite as useful because if you ended up with a variable that looped around in memory or something like that, you could still get access to it. The other thing that would be really good would obviously be to encrypt this in place. So one of the problems is that it's completely raw data. When you dump the memory, it's extremely obvious where this recovery seed is located because it's just a string. You just look for these strings, and you're able to get this critical data out of it. So this was fixed, as I mentioned, in the latest firmware patch, and it didn't affect people using passphrase. So they have a blog post where they also talk about what some of these fixes were. So that's sort of what I wanted to share with you. As a note too, if you're sort of interested in software development, we're going to be looking for software developers in the near future. Feel free to say hi. If there's any questions, I sort of tried to leave it a bit early, so there's time for questions. And I could have prizes for like the best 3 questions. I have a few of these blockchains here. So if you want an embedded small blockchain, you have to ask a question.